Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of Destroying Doubts, where we address your questions and misconceptions about Islam. Today we're revisiting the topic of does God exist, and we're going to be focusing on the contingency argument. We have a special guest joining us all the way from London, Brother Mohammed Hijab. Brother Mohammed, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How you going, brother?
Not bad. How you doing, my friend? You right?
Alhamdulillah, we're good. Thank you for joining us. For those who don't know Brother Mohammed Hijab, you're either living under a rock or maybe you just don't watch YouTube, but Brother Mohammed Hijab is a YouTuber that addresses questions and topics around the existence of God and various other things to do with Islam. He's also an academic. He's graduated from the University of Oxford. He conducts a lot of debates and da'wah online and various other things as well. A long list of, I think, a few books that he's published as well. So inshallah, we'll tap into one of them today when we're focusing on the argument around the contingency. But we wanted to start off actually, Brother Muhammad, by asking you just a sort of foundational point. You know, you've been involved in the da'wah and polemics and debate for a while. Obviously, you've probably come across people who might say that logical arguments or philosophical arguments aren't really needed when participating in the da'wah, that there's enough proof within the Quran and Sunnah to just utilize those arguments. How would you respond to something like that?
I think definitions are very important here. Okay, I mean, when we say logical arguments or philosophical arguments, one has to really define what they mean. And in the English dictionary, if we look at, for example, Cambridge Dictionary, philosophy, for example, is defined as the use of reason, or the use of reason in order to come to truth about, like, you know, the realities of the world or something to that effect. But effectively, it is the use of reason. Now, if that is how we define philosophy, and our tradition has definitions of philosophy which are commensurate with such dictionary definition, then of course we cannot say that the religion of Islam itself is deplete of such philosophy. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah, who many invoke from kind of Salafi leanings and so on, he mentions in many parts of his work, for example, Dar' al-Ta'arud bayn al-Aqli wal-Naql, he mentions that, you know, that the use of al-Hujaj al-Kalamiyya al-Mantiqiyya, or some of the, even he uses the term kalam, you know, Kalamiyya al-Mantiqiyya, as sometimes important for a certain group of people. And this is mentioned in one of his books that he's written, which is the last book, according to some, that he's ever written, which is Dar' al-Ta'arud, Ar-Raddu ala al-Mantiqiyin, or the reply to the Greek logicians. I've detailed this in my newest book, Burhan. Of course, he does actually believe that for the lay people, and he mentions this in his kitab, Mas'alat Huduth al-Alam, he says that the lay people will not engage with high-level philosophical inquiry because they don't need to. And that the best approach for them relates to the verse, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ أَمْ خَلَقُوا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. That were they created from nothing, or were they themselves the creators of themselves? So he says in Mas'alat Huduth al-Alam, which is a book which means the beginning of the creation of the universe, he says about that the best thing to do is to basically invoke this verse. And most people, and I agree with Ibn Taymiyyah here, who am I to agree, but from experience, in terms of battle-tested experience, on-the-ground experience, even until this day, I find that the easiest thing to do is to give people this kind of, or these kinds of options, where you created from nothing, explain to them the impossibility of that being so, were you the creator of yourself, which would have to entail your existence and non-existence at the same time. By extension, did the universe create itself? That's impossible. And so the third option, that there was something which preponderated the universe and is continually maintaining it, is the only logical option is something which springs to mind almost intuitively as a matter of common sense. So Ibn Taymiyyah had that position.
Yes.
But even Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself, you'll find, engages in qiyas mantiqi, in logical argumentation. There are many aqwal of his, or statements of Ahmad, which indicate to the importance of logical arguments. And so it's a misrepresentation of the Salaf to indicate that because some of them done them, which is the counter argument, of course, this praise of certain aspects of kalam which were appropriated with great impropriety by Mu'tazilis and proto-Mu'tazilis, like of Ata ibn Wasil and others, and Abdul Jabbar thereafter, and proponents, that means in any way, shape or form that we as Muslims are incapable or otherwise disallowed from using logical inquiry or rational inquiry in proving God's existence. And the clearest thing about the contingency argument in particular, which I found from Ibn Taymiyyah's works, and once again, who am I to even do the research, in the sense that I actually was directed in this regard to these works by many people who are long-standing scholars and specialists of Ibn Taymiyyah, like Mahr Amir, who was one of the world specialists on Ibn Taymiyyah, wrote a book called Intisar al-Tadmuriyya, to a book of Ibn Taymiyyah called Sharh Aqidat al-Isfahaniyya, where he literally talks about the composition argument, which is the most controversial aspect of the contingency argument. And he details why that can be used in certain contexts, mentioning that there are six definitions of a juz, of part, and one of them, we will come to it, is applicable. So it's incorrect to think that our tradition or the Salaf were against logical inquiry or philosophical argumentation. It's an unnuanced, unreasonable, inappropriate, unacademic way of dealing with the Turath Islami. And I challenge, actually publicly now, any fool who wants to challenge me on this point, who's parading and stopping people from coming to the religion of Islam on the guise that this is against Islam to so-called argue from first principles because they're incapable of doing so. It actually triggers me thinking about the fact that these individuals would rather people remain atheists than be introduced to argumentation which could potentially bring them into the fold of Islam, and has done, quite frankly. So in a nutshell, I think these people are unacademic and incapable. And of course, many of them believe that mantiq, even the study of logic, is haram. So if that is the case, then what business do they have of speaking of such complex matters?
Thank you very much for that. So let's get into the argument then, because I think that's the crux of it here, which is obviously you've been sort of helping people get to a point of understanding that there is an eternal existence, within your argumentation. And the argument you employ, which you just touched on, is the contingency argument, which you say is perhaps the most comprehensive. I don't want to misquote you, but that's how I've understood it, the most comprehensive argument. Can you give us like a summation, maybe within 3 minutes, of what the contingency argument actually is?
Well, the contingency argument merely postulates that there cannot be a world with only dependent and or dependent things that depend upon other dependent things ad infinitum. That is impossible. That's the argument in a nutshell. The proposition is one sentence. There cannot be a world with only dependent things which depend upon other dependent things ad infinitum. If someone says there can be such a world, then we have an argument for them. If someone says you're right, there cannot be such a world, then they have capitulated, which means that there must be something which every dependent thing depends upon, and it depends upon nothing. which is the independent thing. So in other words,
No.
the argument can be made in one sentence, which is a postulation. There cannot be a world with dependent things depending upon dependent things ad infinitum. That's the argument.
Yes.
That's my postulation. If someone agrees with this postulation, then they are invoking a need. The entailment of such agreement or capitulation is the need for a necessary existence or an independent thing.
Yes.
And if they disagree with it, then we have an argument from composition which we make. So this is the basic thrust of the argument.
Okay, and so then when you're talking about dependent or independent things, how does one go about understanding what's meant by this?
Something which is dependent is something which relies upon something else for its existence.
Mm-hmm.
That's different to something being caused by something else. Like, for example, if I cause a house, I can cause a house, but the house can continue to exist even if I die. So if I cause, I can build a house, I cause it. Now, I can cause my child through having sexual intercourse and, you know, all this kind of thing. And then, you know, the child's born after that. Okay, no problem. Now I've caused the child, but it doesn't depend upon me. So in other words, it can outlive me. Now that child can live on and I'll be dead. So the child doesn't depend upon me, my existence for its own existence. So causation is defined as something which brings rise to phenomena.
Yes.
There's terminological definitions. I mean, but yani, the point is that causation is different from dependency, because dependence, something can bring rise to something else, but it doesn't necessarily. It doesn't necessarily have to keep existing for it to exist. So in the case of me, you know, doing what I need to do, bringing children into existence, you know, that's one thing.
Could someone say that the child is dependent on you in the first instance to exist, and then is no longer dependent on you after that? Or is that sort of conflating causation and dependence?
Yeah, maybe conflating the two.
Right.
I mean, it depends on, once again, to be honest, which exact definition, because each philosopher has a different definition. But the point is, we're trying to keep it simple. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible.
No,
there is a difference between causation and dependency.
Yes.
And dependence entails, if we say it depends upon something else for its existence, then it does actually imply continued existence. Like, for example, the sun and the rays of the sun. So the sun, the rays of the sun depend on the sun in order to continue existing.
Yes.
So
that makes sense.
This is a dependency relationship, not just a causal one. So what we're saying is, we're focusing on dependency here. We're not focusing on causation. Although we can make the argument from causation, I don't think there's a problem. But we're for the sake of this brevity and conciseness, we just kind of
So then how do you define independence? Is it just the opposite of dependence, or does it have its own definition outside of dependence?
Well, independent is something which is self-sufficient. So we're talking about something which is self-sufficient, something which in and of itself requires nothing else in order to exist. And that everything else in this context depends upon it for its existence.
Yes. Okay, perfect. So then some might say that the necessary existence, like within this contingency argument, for example, doesn't exactly equal God or Allah. So how does one get from saying that there is a necessary existence to saying that there is Allah without being accused of a God of the gaps type argument?
Well, look, I mean, there's only so much the argument itself can actually bring you. We're not claiming that this argument is going to give you 99 attributes of God. That's certainly not what we're saying. Yeah.
Yes.
And in fact, we believe that as Muslims, most of the attributes of God are actually found out through the Nas, through the textual proof, which is the Quran and the Sunnah.
Right.
So, first and foremost, there is a point at which this argument becomes redundant, which is at points where we're trying to prove the mercy of God or the love of God, all these things. There are certain attributes which can be proved from first principles, like we said, pre-eternality, post-eternality, will. We can prove independence, sovereignty, qayyumiyyah, samadiyah. which are actually plentiful in terms of the number of attributes that there are. And once these attributes are, kind of, proven, if you like, or established, you've, for all intents and purposes, rid the individual from their atheism. The individual can no longer call themselves an atheist, and dare I even say, can no longer even call themselves an agnostic. So they're anywhere between a deist or a classical theist or a theist. These are the three options that they now have. They no longer have agnosticism and atheism as options. So they are no longer agnostics or atheists. So the argument aims to bring someone from the state of agnosticism or atheism to a state of deism or theism or classical theism. Now, we're not saying that's where we should stop, but that's the minimum requirement here. And then obviously we say, well, now the question is, what kind of relationship would you have with this necessary existence?
Yes.
And that the contingency argument answers half the question, because it tells you that you are already in a independent relationship. So in other words, you are in need of the necessary existence, and the necessary existence is not in need of you.
Yes.
The necessary existence is self-sufficient, and you are not. So already there are some boundaries that are being established here, that there's not an equality in this relationship, that without one the other wouldn't exist, that without one the other wouldn't continue existing, without one the other could not even be in any way or express themselves in any way, that without the necessary existence, anything contingent couldn't even express a contingent instantiation.
Yes.
So anything we do is with the permission of the necessary existence by necessity, especially if you've explained the will of this necessary existence. And so the question is, what is what is the appropriate relationship to have? Except, of course, one of submission. Because we're already in submission. I mean, submission can be established here. So if submission is established, a need-based relationship is established, then we're already at a very, promising place.
Yes.
In which case, all that is really left to do, you've got all these attributes of God. You have the attributes of God, like, the will of God. You've got the pre-eternity of God, the post-eternity of God. You've got the self-sufficiency of God. You've got, the oneness of God, which, to be fair, needs a separate argumentation, which is in the Quran. مَا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ إِذًا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَعَلَ بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. In chapter 23, verse 93, that Allah did not have a son, and that He doesn't have any ilah with Him, any God with Him. And had that been the case, that they would have tried to dominate one another, and that they would have tried to outstrip one another. In other words, they cannot be two all-powerful entities.
Right.
So once oneness is established, pre-eternity is established, post-eternity is established, self-sufficiency is established, will is established through particularization, and that's another argument. These are all different arguments we put. Once all of these things are established, the need-based relationship is established. Now you're ready to make the argument for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam being the true prophet of God, and the Quran being the word of God. That's what you're ready for now. And ipso facto, anything that comes from the Quran, therefore, is true.
Yes.
Because if the Quran is true, then anything that comes of Quran in the Quran, especially in reference to who God is true.
No.
And
So just to interject there, so if we could, that's fantastic to understand how you go from sort of these type of arguments to actually establishing Islam and Allah, as sort of the way, because obviously Christians use similar arguments, I'm sure Jews use similar arguments, and others might use similar arguments to try and lead people to their religion as well. So that clarification is very important. But I wanted to backtrack a little bit and just ask, with respect to what you mentioned before about, having an infinite amount of dependent things, or an ongoing series of dependent things. And so we've discussed in the past on other episodes about infinite regress and the problem there. But a question that keeps arising, irrespective of how many times this is discussed, is if you can't have an infinite amount of, in this case, possible or contingent things, then what makes it okay to have a God that is infinite?
Well, the word infinity in abstraction has no meaning. That's the first point. If I say infinite, what does that mean? Infinite what? In order for the word infinite to have a substantive quantitative meaning, it has to be attached to some kind of a predicate or an object. So if I say he's infinitely merciful, he's infinitely just, he's infinitely whatever, yeah?
Right.
So now I'm speaking intelligibly. Before that, I wasn't speaking intelligibly. If I say infinite, but infinite in abstraction is a questionable concept even in the real world as existing or not. Right. So when I say infinite, I'm saying nothing. I might as well say zero. In fact, interestingly, in mathematics, if you divide 0 by 0, you have 3 answers. One of them is infinity. And, you know, one of them is 1 and one of them is 0. There's 3 answers. There's a difference of opinion among them. I mean, there are 3 answers. So the point I'm making is when we speak of infinity, for it to be intelligible, it requires that kind of predication. And so we're not saying God is infinite, because that's not one of the names of God. I mean, God doesn't refer to himself as the infinite. There's no, ayah in the Quran that says, and he is the infinite. That's not the way God he speaks about himself in the Quran. We say God is necessary. I mean, that's something which we can come about by logical necessity. And the Quran refers to this kind of necessity as samadiyah, which is that he's everything that, everything depends upon him and he depends upon nothing. Qayyumiyyah, the thing that min qama yaqumu, basically it lets everything stand. Everything stands in existence because of the foundation of existence, which is God. And as it relates to the infinite regress, this argument doesn't really care if you believe in it or not. It's not a kalam cosmological argument where, there cannot be an infinite regress because infinity cannot exist in the real world. That's not this line of argumentation. Instead, one of the salient aspects of this argument is what's referred to as the argument from composition or tarkib, which in order to conform to all creedal schools and whatever, but also because it makes sense logically, goes in the following way. Premise 1, anything that is made out of pieces is contingent, or you can say is dependent. Premise 2, the universe is made out of pieces. Therefore, premise 3, the universe is contingent. Now, how do we define a piece?
Sorry, Mohammed, what I actually want to do is stop you right there, because we wanted to play you a clip on this specifically, on the composition argument. And then if you could sort of lay that foundation and respond directly to that.
More accurately, how do we know that the universe is a product of intelligent design? You see, as David Hume pointed out long before Darwin's voyage, the reason we believe that watches require a watchmaker is because we know of no instance in which a watch has emerged in any other way. However, the opposite is true of life. We have no examples whatsoever of an intelligent being creating life, and we have countless examples of life emerging naturally through reproduction, which is confined by natural selection. What, then, the Sheikh needs to prove, or at the very least provide a coherent argument for, is how we can be certain that the universe entails a universe maker. He can't just assume it.
All right, Mohammed, so how would you respond to that in light of the contingency argument?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's as relevant to the contingency argument, or at least the one that I've elaborated in my newest book, Burhan, as it is to the Kalam cosmological argument. To the Kalam cosmological argument, it would be seen as something which at least caused a gridlock. And I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of why that may be the case, but why it's also misused by atheists. So for example, if I give you a big elephant, obviously everything is perspectival, right? But if I give you a big elephant and I say that, well, the big elephant is made up of, so the elephant that's big is made up of small parts, therefore the elephant itself is small, would be committing the fallacy of composition, because despite the fact that the elephant is made up of atoms, say, which are small parts, that the elephant itself is big. And so one commits the fallacy of composition when generalizing from part to whole in some mereological way, in such a way that doesn't account for the disparity between the part and whole. The issue, of course, even with the Kalam cosmological argument, which, well, if we're talking about one of many actually Kalam cosmological arguments which we are aware of, Al-Ghazali's one, which is everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And then they say that, well, actually, just because there's causation that exists within the universe, it doesn't mean that the universe itself is made of causes. The problem with it in this context is it assumes that the atheist has knowledge of the whole. So in the case of, for example, the elephant, yeah,
Mm.
we have the knowledge of the whole and the part. In this case, the elephant is big and part of the elephant is small.
Mm.
And so we are able to say that to generalize from part to whole is to commit the fallacy of composition, because there's a disparity between part and whole.
Right.
But the atheist is as ignorant of the whole of the universe as the theist is.
Right.
So the atheist is not able to say that the whole of the universe is not caused by a cause, just as there are causes within the universe. Just as the theist is not able to say with any great level of certainty that despite the universe being, because the universe is made up of causes, that the universe itself has a cause. So what this, which was like a Russellian kind of objection, a very famous one indeed, to this kind of cosmological argument, one can say that there's some kind of a gridlock, that both the theist and the atheist or the anti-theist, because both of them don't have the knowledge of the whole, that neither of them or both of them cannot say that a fallacy of composition either exists and or doesn't exist.
Mm.
I'm not sure if this makes sense. I'll give you another example to make it make. I'll just give another example just to make it make sense. If I say, for example, there is a red wall. There is a red wall. And such red wall is made up of red bricks. Yes, it's made up of red bricks. And not yellow ones, not green ones, not blue ones, not purple ones, but red ones.
Yeah.
So now, is there a disparity between the part and the whole? No, there isn't, because the part is red and the whole is red.
Correct.
And so if an atheist, or someone, not even an atheist in this context, but if someone were to say that to generalize between the part and whole is to commit the fallacy of composition, would be itself fallacious, because such fallacy would not exist or be applicable, because in this case, the part is generalizable to the whole.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see how it doesn't always work in the favor of the atheist. And as we've said,
Yes.
it doesn't, and it cannot always work in the favor of the theist either, if they argue on these grounds. Now, these are recycled old school interrogations, which people like this individual that was speaking, this unqualified individual who I think he retreated from one of the debates, who was meant to come in the University of Oxford. He retreated from that, I think, from what I recall from the emails that I have, and he instead left his friend to have a man who's very much elderly and maybe let him down to be the debate opponent in a famous debate which was watched by millions of people, whereby that individual was humiliated by myself and others, Abdullah Andalusi to be precise. But this individual is just recycling that which has been said by the new atheists for 20 years. It's nothing new. I mean, it's not an undercutter in any way, shape, or form. The contingency argument now, which Ibn Sina and others have elaborated, and Leibniz and in other forms, quite frankly, have spoken about the principle of sufficient reason. Doesn't suffer from the same limitations as would be applicable to such compositional fallacy of this manner. Why? Because number one, the contingency argument can be made not just on physical grounds, cosmologically, but it can also be made ontologically. And by ontologically, I mean something which can be perceived of in the mind, something which is conceptual, something which is metaphysical, something like mathematics. So, for example, if I were to say that a set is made up of its individual members, okay, a mathematical set. A mathematical set now doesn't depend on the physical environment. I mean, maths would be 2 + 2 = 4 in the universe, and 2 + 2 = 4 outside of the universe. There is no logical reason to believe that the laws of mathematics, they are operational within the universe, but then would stop being operational outside of it.
Yes.
This is called a priori reasoning, meaning it's not reasoning which you extract from being outside in the universe or through experience. A posteriori. It's a priori. It's even before the experiences start being an issue. And so if a set is made up of its individual members, such that if such members did not exist, the set itself would be not in existence, then it can be proven on ontological or metaphysical or even mathematical grounds that something is made up of its individual constituents. Something is made up of even a set, a mathematical set. So if I say, for example, set A is A, B, C, that's set A, B, C.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I am expressing set A by saying it's A, B, C.
Yes.
Now, if I say set A is just A by itself, okay, because you can have a set with one member. You can have a set with one member, but you can't have a set with no members. I mean, you can have an empty set, but it wouldn't have anything that it's describing.
Yep.
So any set with one member or more is dependent upon its members in order to exist.
Okay.
Set ABC, for example, is it's dependent on its individual members. Therefore, ABC set ABC is constituted of or has more than one member or one or more member. Therefore, set ABC is dependent upon its members in order to exist. The same thing can be said of the universe itself. So the point is the universe is like, let's say, a pearl necklace. It's made up of pieces. If the pieces don't exist, the universe doesn't exist. It's really as simple as that.
Yes.
If I have a pearl necklace and I get rid of each and every single pearl from that pearl necklace, I no longer have a pearl necklace. Likewise, if I get rid of something, if I get rid of each and individual piece of the universe, I no longer have the universe. So if it's conceivable to remove something or pieces from the universe bit by bit, such that no pieces no longer exist within the universe, then it's inconceivable to suggest that such universe is necessary or independent, because how could it be when it's dependent upon its individual members in order to even be expressed? That's the first point.
Yeah.
The second point, which I think is even more damning, is that if the universe can be understood in a different way in abstraction, then the universe is contingent. The universe can be understood in a different way in abstraction, therefore the universe is contingent. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Something which is necessary, like 2 + 2 = 4, cannot be understood in any other way in abstraction. It's a necessary fact. But something which is contingent in abstraction is something which, without reference to some kind of uninterrupted causal line of determination or antecedent causal events, or whatever it may be, that in and of itself is susceptible A, to destructibility or generation, and or B, can be conceived of in another way without absurdity being a logical byproduct of that. The universe is actually all of those things. Like, in other words, in abstraction, without reference to an independent causal chain, which itself is not part of the universe, can be conceived of in another way. Therefore, the universe in abstraction is contingent. If the universe in abstraction is contingent because it can be conceived of in another way, then it cannot be necessary. And if it cannot be necessary, it cannot be such a thing that everything depends upon it and it depends upon nothing, or that it depends upon itself for continued self-existence, which means that it eventually needs to depend upon something which doesn't depend upon something else, and or something which cannot be conceived of in another way, which means that the universe cannot be the necessary existence by logical necessity. And that is the compositional argument, and it can be made in a series of different ways. But he was attacking one aspect of composition, which is change and actuality, the potential and actual, which is a way that Thomas Aquinas argued. I don't think he's right about that either, because I don't think he understood, actually. I think it went well over his head how Aquinas argued, which is on Aristotelian grounds, the differences between a potential and an actual and a change, that change must be, change applies to things which are potential move into actual. So, for example, an egg is a potential because it ends up being, a chick or something, right?
Yes.
So it's a potential, and so it requires that which is outside of itself in order to change it to be what it is. It requires an external configurator. So the idea really is that anything that is in constant flux and change and movement requires that which is outside of itself in order to change it, because the explanation of its change cannot be explained from within itself. And then you can easily argue on the principle of sufficient reason, as Leibniz and others, including Kurt Gödel, by the way, notable, probably one of the biggest intellectuals the West has ever had, even argued on modal logic grounds that therefore, well, Leibniz more so in this case, that you need an explanation outside of the thing itself, which itself requires no explanation. So the guy he's still stuck on basic GCSE level interrogations, year 11, year 12 type stuff. He, from my understanding, is an unqualified gentleman. He's kind of irrelevant now, and I don't think there's anything he can really do or say to except for that which he's already said. I've heard him say this stuff, I think 5 years ago or something. It's really boring now. It's really boring now, Hisham. It's really boring now, Hisham. And it's something, it shows that his lack of engagement with the literature, his lack of criticality of high level interrogation, his lack of understanding of different types of argumentation, his complete sidestepping or circumnavigating, ignoring the ontological type arguments, the metaphysical type arguments, which are attached, sometimes working in conjunction with the cosmological ones. And all in all, it's I think he's becoming totally irrelevant, and these arguments are boring, which is why his friend, but a cosmic skeptic, but he has kind of no longer associates with him too much and speaks about veganism and all these kind of things, because it's boring things that most people realize is no longer. And his friend, I mean, his friend literally came out, I think it was 8 months ago or something like that, saying that he now sees, after the debate I had with him, the strength of the contingency argument. So people are coming to this argument.
No, I think that's fantastic, and I think that for us it's really the importance of showing Muslims that just because someone presents himself in a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're saying is definitive or the end point. It's good to show the depth and the response and the different perspectives that there are. Alhamdulillah that Islam has a way to respond to these things throughout the tradition and ongoing, that's still there. But I just wanted to shift gears a little bit because I think that there's a lot of good rational arguments that you've presented over your work as well as many others sort of predating our generation that have presented for the necessary being. It's like there's a lot of coherent, sound, powerful arguments, and oftentimes presented from first principles, which obviously makes it quite strong as well. But by way of anecdotal evidence, most people don't, or at least most believers, don't necessarily believe because of these things. These things could strengthen their belief, but it's not necessarily the reason they believe. They might have an experience that causes them to believe. They might have a connection with scripture, some sort of spiritual awakening that causes that. It could be based on reflection, self-reflection, or reflection of the outer world, as an example. Now, would you consider these proofs good reasons for someone to believe? And if so, then what is really the value of having these philosophical or rational proofs?
Well, I mean, look, as I've said before, like there are lots of things which will make someone believe, or some things which make someone firm on their faith, or things which will stop someone from disbelief. These are three areas which I don't think have been investigated thoroughly. I know you say you've got a series of hunches and anecdotes, but the truth is, when I was looking into doubts and stuff like that, I saw that Yaqeen Institute had a few, studies that were done on it. It's really an uninvestigated thing.
Right. Okay.
But I would say that, only time will tell the extent to which arguments like this will bring people to Islam, or could bring them to Islam, especially people at the higher echelons of, let's say, philosophical inquiry or something. going back to what Ibn Taymiyyah said, where he said that some people need this, this kind of dalil, and this is mentioned in his book Al-Radd al-Mantaqiyin. And the second type of people, which are people that will get doubts, for example, from videos like the one that you've just presented, that had answers like the ones that I've just presented not been present, that it could increase that doubt of people. And the third group of people are those individuals who believe and who look into these kinds of things, and they strengthen their faith in Allah. And really interesting, I'll tell you something, right? I mean, I was looking at one particular asbab or sabab al-nuzul for Surah Al-Ikhlas. And one of them, I'm not sure about the veracity of authentication of the... Basically, a Jewish man came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said to him, who created Allah? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he recited Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad. Because if you think about it, if Allah is samad and everything depends upon him and he depends upon nothing, and that's the meaning of one of the meanings of the word samad, then it is the ultimate answer to questions like who created Allah. Because it makes it unintelligible that something which is the necessary being, which has no beginning, can itself have a beginning, and therefore something which is uncreated be created. So common questions, the like of which have been posited throughout the medieval times and all the way to the current ones contemporaneously, are answered by a lot of these kinds of rationalizing. And the fact that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ even recited this surah in conjunction with that question may be an indication of that. Wallahu a'lam.
Allahu a'lam. No. So just on that then, you, in terms of how people believe, or good arguments that people might find for God, we want to play a clip of your recent discussion with Dr. Jordan Peterson, where you presented the contingency argument, and he had this response to it.
You see, the problem with debating people like Richard Dawkins about the existence of God is that he will formulate the argument in propositional terms and then force the person, so to speak. I don't imply any malice on his part, but as soon as you accept that the battle is to be won on propositional grounds, you've already accepted a certain definition of God. And I think you lose the argument instantly. I think the argument for instinct, something like that, is much more powerful.
Okay, so can you please explain to us in a short 1 minute what the fitrah argument is and how it can be used alongside other types of arguments?
Look, the fitrah is not an argument. This is the point. The fitrah is it's instinctive. For example, Ibn Taymiyyah, when he speaks about the fitrah, he says it's instinctive as a child sucking from the breast of a mother. Like, you don't teach a child how to suck from the breast of a mother. It comes instinctively. If I were to put my hand over a candle, it would be, I don't need to rationalize the fact that it's burning my body and that it's causing me harm in order for me to move my hand away from the flame. Likewise, the fitrah, which has now been kind of confirmed by all kinds of cognitive science things, as mentioned to Jordan Peterson, is something which works in a similar fashion. But the problem is, of course, it's the fitrah, as I've explained to Jordan Peterson, is something which can, if you use it as an argument, which it isn't, can bring about the is-ought fallacy. Just because something is a certain way doesn't mean it ought to be that way. In other words, just because you are born believing in God, it doesn't mean, therefore, God exists. So someone may say, well, I've been born with a gay gene. I'm not saying such a gene exists. I think the evidence is against such a gene existing. Or that, I'm born with this kind of incest gene, or whatever it may be. It doesn't mean just because you're born with a gay gene, therefore that you should be gay. It doesn't mean that. This is the is-ought fallacy. It's a fallacious way of thinking. So the instinct fitrah point is an important one, but it's one which brings us to kind of what the human being is, or what kind of nature the human being has. Not an argument for God. It can never be argued for as a demonstrative proof, because then you will have that fallacy. In addition to that, I would also, so I would leave it as that, actually. So I would not use it as an argument, but I would use it as a subsidiary point, especially when making reference to humans' kind of psychological nature.
No. So I agree with you on that. Would you say it's useful for Muslims to expose themselves more to our understanding of the fitrah? Because in a way it puts you in a position where you don't feel the need, like from an Islamic standpoint, the understanding of fitrah, it doesn't put you in a position where you need to be as worried about proving God to, for example, if you, like, to yourself. Some people feel like they go through a crisis where they're like, why do I actually believe? If someone has this understanding according to what Islam says around the fitrah, then it sort of justifies their belief without actually having to justify the belief. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But as I said, I mean, it depends on what the person's needs are. Ibn Taymiyyah, to quote him for the third time, you know, he made this very clear. It depends on the needs of the person. If the person's a lay person who just needs to be jogged or has their fitrah jogged back into place, then the ayah, am khuluqu min ghayri shay'in am humul khaliqun, were they created by nothing or were they themselves the creators of themselves, may be sufficient. And in fact, when one Sahabi, he heard this, he said, kada qalbi an yatir. When I heard this ayah, it was my chest was going to fly out of my heart was going to fly out of my chest. It's such a powerful ayah. It might just be all that one needs to hear.
No.
That were you created from nothing? And these are questions. And sometimes questions can be more powerful than arguments. Because
Yes.
even though there are questions, you can see the line of argumentation, you know, that were you created from nothing, or were you yourself the creators of yourself? You see? So definitely I think that it depends on the person. If the person has been indulging in high level analytic philosophy, you know, then, you know, as Ibn Taymiyyah states, he says, كلما كان الدليل أكثر مقدمات وأخفى. You know, it was every time where the dalil had more premises and it was more difficult, you know, he enjoyed it more, or it was more convincing to him. So some people need that high level stuff. Some people need just a few words. Some people will not need anything at all.
No.
And to generalize it, I think, is difficult.
No, fantastic. That's great insight. Like, keeping in mind, especially for our viewers, ourselves in particular, that, you know, everyone is at a certain stage within their journey, and understanding where that's at and how to address that is very important. There is no silver bullet for these things. So last thing that we're going to do, inshallah, is we want to play another clip for you. This is with respect to the Watchmaker argument, understanding that it might not necessarily be in line directly with the contingency argument, but we did want to get, again, a little bit of a response from you, and we'll end up on this, inshallah. So we'll play that clip now.
To assert from the observation that everything within the universe is changing, that therefore the universe itself is changing, is to commit a fallacy of composition. It's as fallacious as insisting that since everything within the universe is in time, therefore the universe itself is in time. Or that since everything within the universe is surrounded by space, therefore the universe itself is surrounded by space.
So Muhammad, how would you respond to that?
Well, I'm glad that he gave the Sheikh his respect by offering his title. And I you know, applaud his tone, and I think that was respectful. But once again, it's the same low-level interrogations which we've heard from his channel and from his friend's channel for the last 5 to 10 years, which doesn't do anything. And to be quite honest and frank, we've heard from the new atheist movement time and time again, and which have been thoroughly refuted. I mean, invoking Darwinism and so on, even though he hasn't gone into detail about it, is something that Richard Dawkins did, talking about, you know, life especially. I mean, obviously Paley himself, who talked about the Watchmaker's Argument, natural theology, he referred to something called contrivance. Now, contrivance is used in pejorative terms nowadays in vernacular language, but Paley himself, he was using it to mean that something was shaped in a certain way, is carved in a certain way. And of course, now new atheists, foremost among which I would say in the new age has been Richard Dawkins, has made the argument that, well, we don't need to invoke, for example, a watchmaker type intelligence in order to account for the intricacies or sophistications or complexities of biological life, because all that because that's superfluous to the Darwinian mechanism. It's superfluous to the Darwinian mechanism because Darwinism is a sufficient explanation for why such quote unquote contrivances, would be in place. Now, the truth of the matter, Hisham, is this is actually a false argument, because as John Lennox mentioned in his debate with Richard Dawkins, this is conflating agency with mechanism. It's like saying, for example, I drove all the way here to South London from Central London. Now, the mechanism of me driving from here to there can be explained from an engineering perspective through how the car moved and so on, and petrol and all the things up and all that stuff, the catalytic converter and whatever. That's the mechanism, but that does not nullify the fact that there was an agency that literally moved the car from one place to another. In other words, just because there is a mechanism, it doesn't mean that that mechanism requires no agency, which is why Dawkins, of course, he called his book The Blind Watchmaker, because he's almost insinuating that the forces of, actually is stating that the forces are blind. I mean, it's just like, it's as if I drove from my house to this place with blindfolds on my eyes and I couldn't see where I was going, but somehow I managed to get here. We wouldn't accept such a statement or thesis or hypothesis in that situation, and nor would we accept it for nature itself. So the blind watchmaker thesis has already been refuted by high-level academics. Richard Dawkins himself had no answer for that. You can see his second debate, I think it was, with John Lennox. John Lennox mentions in his book, God's Undertaker or something. It's not been responded to. I mean, the new atheists haven't even responded to the responses that they have had to the interrogations that they initially made. They haven't even responded to these things yet. It's been 10 years. There's no response to this. And so people, if you want to be a knowledge producer for new atheism, then why don't you start with things that couldn't have been answered 10 years ago first? Number one. Number two is, let's just state the facts, for God's sake, Let's just state the facts. The sheikh doesn't have to prove anything. The burden of proof is not upon the sheikh for anything. This is what some atheists do. They think there's some kind of food critic situation where they're the ones tasting out arguments and Gordon Ramsay style, telling us what's good and what's bad and what, I'm sorry to say, you're not in that position. What indeed needs explanation, or if it doesn't need one, then you can remain agnostic or otherwise ignorant to it, is the fact that there is fine-tuning in the universe. Now, two simple facts. Fact one, the universe exists, that there is something rather than nothing. That's something we can all agree on. I think the man with the long hair there, rationality, he can, even he can say, yes, something rather than nothing. Okay, no problem. The second point is that the universe is fine-tuned for life to exist. Now, when I say fine-tuned, I'm not talking about the electromagnetic constant. I'm not talking necessarily about, the gravitational constant and these 6 numbers, which the argument has been made. I'm talking about the fact that in order for science to be done in the first place, there needs to be stability, uniformity, and regularity. That is because if there isn't any of those things, science cannot be done, as John Haldon mentions. These are prerequisites for science. They're not something which is discoverable by it. For example, if I were to measure the boiling point of a water today and realize it was 100 degrees, and then done it tomorrow and realize it was 1,000 degrees, and after tomorrow it was minus 1,000, then there would be no predictability, there'd be no stability, there'd be no regularity. So science would become a fruitless enterprise, a haphazard one, and in fact a meaningless one, an unintelligible one, an impossible one. And for that reason, science could not be done. So science is contingent on the fact that patterns of nature are habitual and they continue operating in the past, at least are anticipated to operate in the future as they have in the past. Otherwise, as we've mentioned, it would be a situation where this phone would be exploding. Why do I assume that this phone is not exploding? One of my people, professors in the university. He said, why is this cup not exploding? It's not exploding because why do we not even anticipate? There is no doubt in my mind, Hisham. There is no doubt in my mind, Hisham, that this phone is going to explode. Have you ever thought of it? Maybe there was some small doubts because Samsung had some issues before.
Yeah, they did.
I know they did. But I don't lose sleep over that. I think the guy with the long hair, I don't think he loses sleep thinking that his mobile phone is going to blow up in his face. I don't think he does. I don't think he does. And the reason why is because he himself acknowledges that there is predictability. I don't think he thinks it's going to blow up in his face. The thing is going to blow up in his face. And the reason why is because he thinks, the phone is going to act in a similar way in the future as it has in the past. So this is an admission almost implicit that regularity, stability, uniformity are part of the natural environment around us, and prerequisite for science.
Fantastic.
So the fact that regularity, stability, and uniformity are prerequisites for investigation, and we know that the universe is regular and stable and uniform enough to harbor life. And this is my question to this guy. Actually, I don't even want him to answer because, to be honest with you, I'd rather ask someone more qualified. But someone like him, maybe he can speak to his teacher, Cosmic, or someone else, what is the best explanation for this? That's the question. What is the best explanation for the fact that the universe is uniform and regular and stable enough to allow life to exist? Is it intelligence or non-intelligence? Oh, you can bring a third option if you like. If you can find one, no problem. You can, as you're, trying to find things, go ahead and try and find one. But is it knowledge or lack thereof? Is it something which has knowledge, which has endowed these things with the universe with this thing, or not? I mean, is it? No. What is my question is, what is the explanation?
Yes.
An atheist has a very robust and plausible, reasonable explanation, which in fact is the salient explanation, which we use for abstraction, I should say, abduction, which is knowledge and intelligence, so on. The atheist has no such explanation. So, and agnost doesn't know he's ignorant. He admits freely. He's not embarrassed to admit that he's ignorant on such matters. So why should these people that are not embarrassed to admit that they're ignoramuses on these matters, be telling us or even questioning us on any of these things?
No, that's great. I appreciate that detailed response. So look, that does wrap up the interview. I'm sure there's a lot of other questions that we could have gone into as well, but for the sake of time, for the sake of our viewers, we'll end it there, inshallah. Before we do go though, you did mention your book, Al-Burhan, which details the contingency argument. For people that are interested in grabbing that, I know you guys are currently allowing it downloadable for free. Can you just give people details of how they can find it?
They can get it on sapiensinstitute.org. It's called the Burhan. You can Google it, it'll probably come up. It's also available on Amazon for a very cheap price. I'm not sure if it's there in Australia. If not, then just get the PDF version or whatever from the Institute, and it's free of charge.
Fantastic. Brother Mohammed, thanks for joining us. Jazakallah khair for taking your time out, for being with us and giving detailed responses, sharing some insights with us. Brother. Thank you very much. To everyone at home, thank you for listening. Before you go, please comment, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can see every time we upload. And inshallah, until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.